Hey everyone, I am Jen Panero from Connect Chad's Board. Today I'm chatting with Ed Worteck. He's another Chad's Board resident about some things going on related to Painters Folly. So let's dive in. Um, Ed, can you tell us a little bit about what is Painters Folly and why is it important to Chad's Board?
Well, Painters Folly is what's called an Italianate house that was built in 1857 by Samuel Painter. And the painters go back to Chadds Ford and this area of Pennsylvania into the 1600s. They were one of the largest landowners from the original grants for Pennsylvania. And the house itself was built in 1857. The painters at that point primarily lived in north of Chadds Ford. So the house was actually their summer home. And the house was called Painters Folly initially by people in the township because the style of the house was unusual. It wasn't the typical federal or colonial style. Nevertheless, it was a very, very popular meeting place for people. And eventually, and probably the most significant aspect of Painters Folly is that Howard Pyle, who was a prominent artist in late 19th and early 20th century America, established a summer school. He was a relative of the Painter family. And in the early 1900s, he started a summer school there, bringing his regular students from his school in Wilmington. And among those students was N.C. Wyeth. And N.C. Wyeth and the Wyeth family become established in Chadds Ford as a result of N.C. Wyeth's experience at Painters Folly. If we jump forward to almost a century, in the last 20 years of his life, Andrew Wyeth used the house as a studio. Several different rooms of the house became a personal studio for him. And he did some of his most significant work in the late part of his career in Painters Folly, including paintings of Painters Folly and the current residents of Painters Folly at the time, the Sapallos. So the house has a significant relationship to the development of the artistic community in this part of Pennsylvania and nationally. The final thing is the property itself that Painters Folly sits on was part of what we now know as the Battlefield Park for the Battle of Brandywine. So most of the land was originally connected actually directly to the Painter property. And in many, many ways, Painters Folly is a natural extension of the current Battlefield Park.
That's really interesting. That is sort of really the core of Chad's Ford history and with multiple elements. And I know I've actually volunteered for the Chad's Ford Art Show. I know that ties back to the Wyeth family as well. We did a little feature on them not that long ago. So and let's back up a little bit. So now that we kind of have some information about Painters Folly, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Ed, and like why I would choose you to be the person to talk about this?
Well, my professional background, my undergraduate degree is in American history from Washington College, another colonial relationship. And my graduate degree is an MFA from the University of Maryland in studio art. And that particular program was unusual and still is to a certain degree because not only do students have to have credits in studio art, but there were extensive credits in art history as well. One of my professors at the time when I was in graduate school was a man named John Wilmerding. And John Wilmerding was then the deputy director of the National Gallery. Eventually, he became the chair of the art history department at Princeton. And I had a seminar with him on an exhibition that he was working on called American Light. And it was basically about the original creation of what would become the American School of Art in painting and drawing and photography. Wilmerding was also influential because shortly after I had the course with him, he was the person who actually curated the exhibition of the Helga paintings for Andrew Wyeth, and then went on to be a close friend and advisor to the Wyeth family up until his death about 18 months ago. The current Wyeth Foundation, which oversees the Wyeth collection of work, 7,000 works of art, was basically developed as a result of the recommendations from John Wilmerding. So very, very early on, I had a lot of relationship. My primary medium is photography, but also working with painters, working in art history. In addition to my teaching career, most of which was as chair of the Art and Art History Department at Goucher College in Baltimore, I was also a faculty member at Yale, specifically teaching photography to painters. So that, as along with a long residency here in Chadds Ford, kind of made this a logical area for me to get involved in. The final thing is, in my own work as a photographer, a lot of the work has involved historic preservation related projects, including a book on the farm history of architecture in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a book that also pursued topics in land conservation and farming in Lancaster as well. So Painters Folly was a natural fit for me.
That sounds like a very relevant intersection of your experiences. Absolutely. So this came to my attention. I was sitting in a township meeting and I remember them talking about Painters Folly, and you were there. At the township meeting, they didn't really get into a lot of what's going on, but so I would like you to tell me, like, what's happening with Painters Folly now? Sort of what's the news in that area, and what do the residents need to know about it?
Sure. Well, I was appointed basically the township liaison with for Painters Folly back in January, but I actually began work last summer after the first public meeting at the township in August to discuss Painters Folly. What we've been doing is basically contacting professionals who, number one, can support in the future any kind of historic preservation grants or projects. So one of the first things that I did was Howard Pyle had two biographers who developed a recent modern history of Pyle's life, including work in Painters Folly. And it was a husband and wife team at Purdue University, Robert and Jill May. So a couple of months ago, I contacted them, told them about the Painters Folly's current situation, the township wanting to look towards some kind of preservation effort with it. And they wrote a letter that we can use and currently are using for any kind of grant applications, basically supporting how critical this was to the development of modern American art history, and also how important Harold Pyle and his work at Painters Folly was to that development. In addition, we've been meeting, and for example, in the last couple of weeks, we met with both the Brandywine Conservancy and Museum, getting their advice on different avenues that we can pursue as far as grant proposals. Unfortunately, the museum and the Conservancy, as a result of the damage that they received in the floods here 4 years ago, are not in a position to take over Painters Folly at this point. But they're more than willing to help us as far as approaching funding and grant sources. The other thing is we've begun exploration with different funding sources that may be able to provide funds to either preserve or stabilize Painters Folly. We're in the process of meeting people for the first time who are interested in possibly leasing Painters Folly. And again, I can't go into too much detail, and it's very exploratory, but for the possibility of finding some additional uses for it. The director of the Brandywine River Museum just gave us a very interesting suggestion about possibly approaching historic restoration architectural firms looking at Painters Folly as a possible office location or center. We're also trying to see if we can find funding groups that might support it as a research center for both history related to the history of the battlefield in Chadds Ford, and also art history. And last but not least, we're trying to pursue with the state of Pennsylvania, some of our elected representatives and veterans group, the possibility of rejoining Painters Folly and the land that it occupies with the battlefield park, to possibly use that as an additional site for people visiting the park, because it'll really give them a view of what 19th century Chadds Ford looked like pre-Civil War. Also, literally because the painters were involved with the original ownership of much of the battlefield, a sense of what that family's history was like.
Sure. That's really interesting. And you actually got ahead of me because I was going to ask you what are some of the potential future ideas for Painters Folly, but you answered that question already. Was there something that happened that sparked this interest? Like, was there a change in the status of Painters Folly that caused the township to want to that got the township interested in sort of doing something? Yeah, like how did this come about?
Well, I think it started going all the way back to when the township purchased Painters Folly. Their original motivation was actually to prevent development. They were concerned that there's a little over 3 acres around the house itself, and their fear at the time was somebody, a developer, could buy it, tear down the house, and build townhouses or other projects there. And because of the historical relationship. And, one of the little things that is curious, the township's building, which was originally Turner's Mill, that the township occupies now, was actually originally part of Painters Folly and part of the art school that Harold Pyle ran from Painters Folly. So the whole idea that this was really something critical to Chatsford history and American history was the early motivation. The problem was that some of the initial ideas, and the township commissioned a study of basically historic preservation company to take a look at what could be done with the building. The problem is that many of the early ideas did not prove to be feasible as a result of housing code issues and other things. So very recently, part of what has happened is the township realizes long-term, this is something that they can't support. They saved it with taxpayer money, but we don't have the infrastructure tax base to, indefinitely support the building. And I think that's the most recent motivation.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So on that note, I have heard you talk about grant money and things like that. Can you tell us if it's not taxpayer dollars, which I think people in Chatsford are curious to know, like who
Sure,
pays for all of
sure.
this? So are there some ideas around and I'm sure it's going to depend on what the final outcome is in terms of how it gets used, right? So if it's
Right.
used for if it's used for studios or something like that, there may be a rental income that's supporting this. If it's a museum, maybe there's grants. So do you have any ideas in terms of who's paying for kind of the future of Painters Folly, or is that really dependent on sort of the outcome of how it ends up being used?
I think it really depends on the outcome of how it's going to be used. I mean, what we're hoping for is to find somebody who basically is a partner who will make sure that they provide for the future in whatever use they might have for Painters Folly. And the township would affect, and I don't want to get into too much of the technicalities, but there's a number of easement agreements that the township could specify, which make sure that anybody, whether it's a art historical association or a private association or somebody wanting to use it for, let's say, non-intrusive commercial aspects. And I want to be deliberately vague because that's on the table, but we don't have anything specific. The idea is they would be responsible for the long-term maintenance and care of Painters Folly. At the same time, they would be restricted from making changes that would violate the historical integrity, character, change the overall use of the land. I mean, one of the things that I'm most interested in pursuing, and I think the township as well, is to try to see if the state of Pennsylvania will actually get involved in really using the relationship between Painters Folly and the Battlefield Park to actually promote the Battlefield Park in a way that currently it isn't. As I'm sure there are a number of months during the year when the Battlefield Park is not open. It's only open 2 days a week during the regular season. And in many ways, it's one of the embarrassments, I think, for the state of Pennsylvania, that the Battlefield Park is the most publicly known area that really points to the most important battle in the history of the American Revolutionary War, and is also a site of so many veterans events that basically cover veteran service, starting from before the Revolutionary War up to, current wars in the Middle East, that the state could become more proactive in securing the future of Painters Folly and combining it with the battlefield park.
That's really interesting. That is all news to me. So that's great to know. And here's my final question. So for those of us in Chadsport who are interested or around the Brandywine Valley area, how can we help? Like what could people in this area do to move this project forward, or ensure that Painters Folly is preserved in the way that it should be?
I think the biggest thing that people could do is to let the township know that they understand that there are serious efforts moving the Painters Folly preservation forward and trying to relieve the taxpayers of any burdens, essentially saying, we understand that the township cannot support indefinitely Painters Folly, but we want to see it preserved. And I think sending that message to the township supervisors is important. I would also ask them to contact the elected officials, specifically state legislatures that cover our districts, and raise the question, why is it that the battlefield park is not supported in the way that it deserves, both historically and as far as the Center for Veterans Events? And I think both of those things would be helpful. And if there is a godmother or godfather out there who's willing to help us and provide an endowment for Painters Folly, we would certainly welcome them with open arms.
Yeah, that is very true.
And I guess the other thing is we're trying to research as much in foundations and grant opportunities, but anybody else who may have expertise in that area, who know possible resources, please let us know. Contact me, contact the township manager, any of the township supervisors, but particularly Kathleen Goodyear, who's the supervisor who's been working with Painters Folly very closely, and with me, who just has been extraordinary in all of her research and efforts.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing all this information about Painters Folly. It was new to me. And so hopefully we can, help everyone understand why it's important, and some really sort of productive ways that we can preserve this really important piece of Chadsport history. So I appreciate your time. And I'll leave some email addresses and additional information in the notes underneath this post. So if people want to follow up with you or whoever else, they will have those resources. So thanks so much, Ed. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Jen, for your interest, and everybody out there. I apologize for my monologues, but thank you for your interest as well.
Appreciate it. All right.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
Thanks.